In the piercing silence of the Arctic, where the wind whips like invisible blades and the ice holds secrets older than any war, she was the only one who saw it. A thin, almost imperceptible line opened in the infinite white, a living gash, pulsing as if the ground itself breathed. While the radar insisted on showing nothing, while signals failed and technology surrendered to the magnetic void, her eyes captured the impossible. It wasn't just ice breaking, it was a warning. Something was moving beneath the surface, something large enough to swallow men and machines without a trace. And in that instant she knew, if she didn't act, they would all be dead before the cold finished counting. She screamed, but the wind swallowed her voice. She ran toward the commander, feeling the ice give way slightly beneath her heavy boots. The sound was subtle, like a deep sigh from the depths, but each step felt like an invitation to the abyss. The commander hesitated. After all, nothing on the panel confirmed what she was saying, and it was precisely this hesitation that nearly cost the troop their lives. Because, seconds later, a dry crack echoed like a gunshot, and the crevice opened wider, revealing a liquid, icy darkness. But what emerged from there wasn't just water, it was the shadow of what none of them were prepared to face. If this story gave you goosebumps, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. The Arctic stretched out before them like a horizonless white desert, where sky and earth seemed to merge into a single mass of cold and silence. Gusts of wind blew fine particles of snow, forming veils that danced across the frozen ground, hiding and revealing shapes as if the ice had a life of its own. The outpost was just a handful of metal modules surrounded by motionless antennas, resembling a handful of forgotten toys in the middle of a dead planet. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil, metal, and damp clothing. Men and women moved with a mechanical rhythm, each focused on their duties, but all with the same cautious gaze of someone who knew this territory did not forgive mistakes. She, however, was different. She had a habit of pausing for long seconds before the panoramic windows, as if listening to something the others ignored. Her name echoed little in the corridors, new to the team without the stories of war and glory that the veterans carried in their hearts. Perhaps that's why, when she raised hypotheses or pointed out unusual details, she received quick, disinterested glances, as if she were just another recruit trying to prove her worth. But there was something about her way of observing that was disturbing. She didn't look at the obvious. She didn't focus on the storms on the radar or the mechanical warnings flashing on the screens. Her eyes searched for what was hidden in the absolute white outside. That morning, while the commander reviewed reports and the team adjusted equipment, she noticed a subtle speck on the ice, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to pulse to its own rhythm. No one noticed. It was as if she was seeing something on a different frequency, something that escaped logic and measurement. She felt a chill that didn't come from the cold. Maybe it was just light reflected strangely, she thought for a moment, trying to dispel her unease, but she couldn't, because deep down she already knew that nothing in that place happened by chance, and the Arctic silence was sometimes louder than any siren. She tried to ignore the smudge on the white horizon, as if pushing away a dangerous thought, but it grew inside her like a persistent whisper. The team followed their morning routine, calibrating antennas, recording readings, comparing charts with the previous night. Sergeant Ross, with whom she'd never exchanged more than a few words, passed behind with a low comment, the kind you never see in a report. Arctic mirage. Every rookie sees it. They laughed. The sound of laughter caught in the icy metal of the walls and hurt. She took a deep breath, squeezed her gloves as if asking permission, and approached the panel. The digital lines said everything was normal, but normal in this place was a cruel word. Outside, a darker band cut through the white like a newly formed bruise, hinting at a tension in the body of the ice that the instruments couldn't detect. The wind, which she had learned to hear by its timbre, had changed key without the barometer noticing, as if it were flowing through invisible tunnels, a sign of air corridors beneath the crust, a sign of movement beneath. When she spoke to Commander Hale, the room seemed to shrink. He had that Academy's taught firmness, the voice that organizes chaos. "No radar, no crack," he replied, his eyes glued to the screens, as if reality existed only when lit green. There was something between them, an unspoken territory that would never have a place there, not with hierarchy, not with those eyes watching. But she saw his fingers hesitate for a second as she described the sound she'd heard outside. Not the classic crack of breaking ice, but a muffled rumble, like the breathing of a giant animal. It was only a second. Then the mask returned, and with it, the order to maintain protocol. Sometimes obeying was another way to die slowly. In the mess hall, the conversation revolved around ancient times of war and man-eating snow. With each story, the authority of the past piled bricks on top of her voice. "You're good with numbers? Where did you come from again? This is different from your manual." She answered little. The shame of not being heard burned in silence, and the silence there was more cutting than the wind. Between one spoonful and the next, she felt a slight tremor in the ground, so subtle it could have been mistaken for the generator's vibration. No one noticed. Outside, plumes of snow rose in straight lines, as if space itself were being pulled from beneath, and that vision, a signature only the obstinate eye recognizes, scratched at the door of consciousness again. She said it again. She suggested a short patrol, suggested marking coordinates, suggested simply watching. Ross slammed the tray down, irritated by her insistence. "We're not abandoning equipment out of superstition." The word superstition stuck to her like dry ice. When she stepped out into the courtyard alone, the wind gave her courage back in handfuls of icy air. The faded midday light painted low shadows. The sound echoing beneath her boots resembled swollen wood about to give way. In the distance, blocks of ice stacked in ribs, ridges of pressure, a sign of plates pushing in opposite directions. She knelt, placing her palm on the ground, feeling the vibration that can only be perceived with the entire body attentive. It wasn't the hallucination they laughed at. It was the memory of the world moving. She returned and pressed again. Hale finally looked up from the panel, and in a flash she recognized in his gaze something that wounded and strengthened her at the same time. Trust mixed with fear. He couldn't sign a deviation without confirmation. She understood, but didn't back down. Some wars are won before they begin, when someone decides they'll see, even if no one believes them. At the end of that shift, when the lights dimmed and the base looked like a ship surrounded by a solid ocean, she stood at the window once more. The smudge now pulsed more clearly, like an eyelid about to open, and that was when she realized the instruments weren't just lagging, they were blind across an entire swathe of the map, as if the ice had learned to lie. The first decision then wouldn't be theirs, it would be hers, and she wouldn't let the white decide who lives and who sinks. The next day, the wind grew heavier, as if carrying a hidden intention. The antennas vibrated with a high-pitched, thin sound, almost painful to anyone with trained ears, but no one seemed to care. In the monitoring room, the graphs remained stable, as if the entire Arctic was sleeping under a perfect layer of ice. That was precisely what disturbed her. The Arctic never slept. There were always small variations, minute fluctuations, that the numbers translated into patterns. Now, what she saw on the screens was an artificial silence, a forced calm that didn't fit the natural behavior of that place. Commander Hale maintained a neutral tone, assigning tasks without mentioning the previous day's conversation, as if ignoring it were a way to resolve the situation. She knew this kind of strategy. It was like turning a blind eye to the approaching storm. As she crossed the outer corridor, she felt the subtle creaking beneath her boots again, but this time accompanied by a deeper, more distant sound, as if something were dragging weight deep within the ice. She stopped, held her breath, trying to pinpoint the direction, but the wind scattered the vibration in all directions. Ross passed by, took a quick look, and continued on without asking. To him, it was nothing more than paranoia. To her, every second of indifference increased the chance that by the time they noticed, it would already be too late. In the mess hall, the topic was the arrival of a new shipment of supplies, which radar indicated was less than 20 kilometers away. The conversation was light, but with every laugh, she heard, in her mind, the sound of the crevasse growing, the pressure of the ice sheets colliding in the darkness. She wanted to speak, but held her tongue. Her words there lost strength in the face of skeptical looks. Later, outside, the sky darkened into a dense blue-gray hue, and visibility dropped by half. It was one of those sudden phenomena that nature sets without warning, turning minutes into traps. Even so, part of the team was sent to check the external storage. She followed it with her eyes, noticing that, right on the horizon, the white warped slightly, like stretched fabric. The detail was so subtle that only someone who spent hours observing would notice. But she did. When she tried to get attention, Hale urged her to focus on the internal check, as if that weren't a priority. The chill she felt didn't come from the temperature, but from the realization that not only the radar, but also the command's confidence was blind. At the end of the shift, as everyone retired, she stood alone in the observation area. The dim sunlight filtered through the clouds, creating patches of brightness that moved slowly across the surface. Between these patches, she saw the same dark spot again, larger, more defined. She closed her eyes and focused on the sounds, not the howl of the wind, but that muffled, deep sound that sounded like a slow heartbeat, coming from deep within the frozen earth. Instinct screamed that something was alive, and it was no ordinary animal. The Arctic was trying to speak, but no one would listen, and she knew, when ice speaks and is ignored, it finds another way to be heard, usually by shattering everything around it. Isolation had a smell, a sound, and a weight. It smelled of over-dried clothing, of oil that insisted on seeping into pores, of reheated food that resembled nothing grown on Earth. It sounded like the constant vibration of generators and the amplified breathing of the corridors, a minimal orchestra repeated until the mind mistook silence for threat. It weighed heavily on Commander Hale's shoulders as he walked through the base, his tablet clutched in his hand as if holding an invisible rudder. Outside, the world was white and uninhabitable. Inside, routine was the only defense against the temptation to panic. Hale had learned to contain his panic from years in the field, but what experience didn't tell him was how to handle a request for a deviation without a hint of technical confirmation. Between reputation and a recruit's intuition, he knew where his superior's eyes would land if something went wrong. Still, that morning, when he passed her in the hallway and saw the weary determination on her face, he felt an unease that wasn't simple disagreement. It was the memory of an old night, when he had also chosen the canvases, and a man did not return. The American base, erected like a fist against the wind, displayed flags stiffened by the cold and antennas that looked like crosses embedded in the ice. There was an unexpected sense of homeland in every metal seam. Ross, in the back, counted the helmets lined up, joking about the ghost of the crack as if closing a closet to prevent a nightmare from escaping. She crossed the courtyard with measured steps, aware that any haste could be interpreted as hysteria. She made notes by hand in a plastic-covered notebook, an ancient gesture that many there considered folkloric, recording details that the panels neglected, the depth of snow deposited in a particular corner, the behavior of the shadows cast in the afternoon, the frequency of the cracks far from the base that came in threes, never in twos. This silent, personal knowledge grew like a path parallel to the official one, and it was in this that her confidence rested when everything else slipped away. Hale stopped at the main window and stared into space for too long, a privilege not afforded to those in command. Then, as if caught in a forbidden thought, he returned to his calculated pace. He gathered the team, explained the arrival of the supplies, repeated the approach protocol, and for a second his voice faltered, almost imperceptible, but the kind of crack only the attentive detect. When she asked to review the overland route and suggested skirting the slick area, his eyes wandered to the screens, then back to her, and for a breath there was a silent agreement between different realities, that of the numbers that indicated no danger, and that of his body that already sensed it. He shook his head. The no came out elegantly, politely, coated with justifications, but deep inside, it sounded like an apology. In the mess hall, someone turned on an old radio to drown out the atmosphere, and an American song from decades past spilled across the steel, displaced like a memory that appears when it shouldn't. She sat in a corner, watching the snow streak the window with diagonal lines. The pattern was hypnotic, and within that hypnotism she saw the irregularity again, the white being pulled by an invisible force like a sheet sucked down a drain. A younger soldier, perhaps bothered by her silence, tried to make conversation, asked which state she was from, if she missed the open sky and the endless roads. She responded with a brief smile, telling him about a city where the wind had another name and people suffered in the sunlight. She didn't say that the loneliness of the Arctic hurt less than the loneliness of not being believed. This was a wound she kept close to the warmth of her chest, because revealing it would be asking for care from someone who doesn't know what to do with care. Hale signed the afternoon's orders with hands that didn't tremble, but wanted to. There was a hard ethic to leadership, protecting without showing fear, deciding without betraying what one knows inside. He passed her quarters and saw the notebook open on the bed, the numbers scrawled next to poetic observations that no report accepts. The wind changed direction without moving the flag. The sound came from below, like an animal thinking, "The white man is lying." Out of respect, he closed the door without entering. He didn't know that she across the hall had also stopped in front of his the night before, her hand raised in the air as if asking permission to cross the hierarchy and say only, "Believe." The gesture didn't happen. The Arctic doesn't forgive gestures that don't happen. The afternoon fell with a humid rush, and the isolation took on the feel of a cloister. The ice farther north began to raise ridges like ribs beneath the skin, and the base anchored there felt like a stubborn body before an immobile giant. She sensed something beyond the weather weighing on Hale, and the compassion that welled up was equally forbidden and necessary. It wasn't romantic affection, though there was tenderness. It was recognition, two solitary people in the same corridor, each harboring a truth that couldn't be reported. And in that recognition, the most dangerous crack wasn't in the ice, but in the very fabric that held them together. Trust. When she offered to inspect the perimeter alone, with a hand probe and a double rope, he took 3 seconds to respond. 3 long seconds, filled with images that only fit in the minds of those who have pushed people to their limits. By saying no, she chose the safety of the procedure. As she turned her back, she heard the dull crack in the distance, not loud enough to trigger alarms, but sure enough to shatter that last bit of peace. And without anyone in the room noticing, isolation closed the last door between them and what lay below. The storm arrived like a candle being blown out with a violent blast. A curtain of dense snow swallowed the horizon, and the light turned a thick grey, unable to reveal any defined shape just a few meters away. Inside the base, the sound of the wind became a continuous roar, as if a gigantic animal were circling the structure, searching for a weak point to attack. Cold seeped through the cracks, and even with the forced heating, the air felt like it cut through the skin. The whipping antennas emitted sharp creaks, each blow reminding her that outside, nothing was solid forever. The sensors began to fail, not all at once, but at irregular intervals, leaving black holes in the readings. First, the atmospheric pressure coordinates disappeared, then the tracking of microcracks in the ice. To anyone less observant, it was simply the storm interfering, but she knew the pattern was no coincidence. The gaps in the data were too specific, as if the system itself was being forced to see only what was safe to see. As the team hurried between consoles and panels, Hale's expression remained rigid, but her eyes would occasionally drift to the corner of the window, where only white could be seen. She, motionless, watched the system's glitches tick by, each lack of information sounding like a countdown. The internal radio crackled, spitting out fragments of words cut off by static, and then fell silent. Only the sound of the wind and her heart beating too fast remained in the forced silence. Sergeant Ross cursed, dropping a cable to the ground, but she ignored the small chaos to focus on the larger one, the crevasse. Somewhere out there, beneath the snowdrift, it was opening wider, and with each passing minute, it sucked in not just ice, but any trace of certainty. Without asking permission, she crossed the corridor and entered the equipment room, grabbing a pair of thermal imaging binoculars. Hale noticed the movement and, instead of stopping it, simply watched. It was as if he knew that at that moment, no hierarchy could control what was about to happen. Leaning against the icy frame of the outer door, she aimed in the direction where the stain should be. Nothing but vivid blurs of diffuse heat, patches that moved slowly as if breathing. This made no sense. Ice doesn't breathe. She put away her equipment, but not her certainty. There was something beneath the crust, and it wasn't static. The main generator swayed, its lights flickering in an almost hypnotic rhythm. Some laughed, trying to ease the tension, but the sound from below left no room for doubt. A deep, dry crack reverberated beneath the base structure, accompanied by a long vibration that made the metal mugs on the tables clink. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to commit the sound to memory. It wasn't just ice yielding under the weight. It was a living sound, as if something were breaking free after being trapped for too long. And when she opened her eyes, the wind seemed to suddenly die down, not out of calm, but out of anticipation, as if even the storm wanted to hear what was coming next. The moment she realized the truth didn't come with a cinematic snap, but with a slow sequence of details that fell into place like pieces of a puzzle no one wanted to put together. That early morning, the base slept with the lights on low, and the main corridor seemed narrower, stuffy, as if the air carried something too heavy to breathe. The sound of the wind was different, less harsh and deeper, like a muffled drum beating at irregular intervals. She knew that when the wind changes tone, it's because the terrain beneath it has changed too. She grabbed her thermal jacket and, without asking permission, stepped out into the courtyard. Outside, snow fell in flakes so dense they stuck to her face like tiny needles, and then she saw. The stain wasn't a stain anymore. It was a jagged line, darker, cutting through the white like a fresh scar, and above it, small columns of vapor escaped like warm breaths into the frigid air. She knelt, removing her glove for just a few seconds to feel the ice with her bare skin. There was a vibration there. It wasn't imaginary, not the product of exhaustion. The ice pulsed beneath her hand, as if a heart were buried deep within. The sensation was so strong that her body reacted on its own, taking a step back, pure survival instinct. She hurried back inside and found Hale alone, reviewing the radar glitches. His eyes had that gleam of someone who's already realized something isn't right, but still refuses to admit it. "It's happening now," she said, and her voice carried a raw urgency he couldn't ignore. Hale stood up slowly, like someone walking to the edge of a cliff to check if it really is a cliff. They walked together to the observation room. Outside, the snow swirled strangely, always swirling in the same spot, as if an invisible drain were sucking the air down. Hale pressed his lips together, and in that instant she knew he believed her, not because of the words, but because of the way his hand tightened on the edge of the table. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds, because the truth here carried a weight that couldn't be sustained with sentences. It was the truth that the Arctic wasn't just yielding to heat or pressure, it was opening up, and whatever was underneath wasn't just ice moving. It was something he'd waited too long to get out. The confrontation with the troops' disbelief began before she even opened her mouth. The moment she entered the main room, carrying her thermal binoculars and notebook, she was met with eyes ready to dismantle any argument. Ross, leaning against the wall, crossed his arms with that half-smile of someone about to cut someone off. Two other technicians exchanged low jokes, pretending the cables in their hands were their top priority. Hale stood in the center, like an anchor in a sea of distractions. She took a deep breath, feeling the icy air scratch her throat, and began to describe what she had seen. The steam rising from the crevasse, the vibration beneath the ice, the swirls fixed in the snow. There was no drama in her voice, only cold precision, because she knew that emotion would be interpreted as hysteria. Ross didn't wait for the end. "Common condensation, it happens whenever there's a temperature change. The radar doesn't show anything." The comment was accompanied by muffled laughter. She kept her eyes on him but answered for everyone. "The radar doesn't show because it lost part of its reading in the last storm, and you know that." The silence that followed wasn't one of agreement, but discomfort. No one there liked to be reminded of mistakes they couldn't fix. Hale finally spoke, asking them to let her finish. As she described the pattern of faults and their coincidence with the slick's advance, some avoided looking at her. Others, like Ross, held her gaze defiantly. When she finished, the room was divided. Some held firm to protocol, others seemed too uneasy to ignore it. Hale thanked her but gave no immediate orders. His prudence was a difficult wall to cross. As she left, she overheard fragments of conversation. "He's seeing something. He wants to show off. If it were serious, the radar would show it." Each sentence was a nail in the coffin of the truth she carried. But what kept her going was the knowledge that the ice didn't obey protocols or bruised egos. It gave in when it wanted to, and when it did, it took everything with it. And in that moment, more than convincing the troops, she understood that she needed to prepare for the moment when no one would have any choice but to believe. When the radar turned enemy, it wasn't with a sudden, obvious error, but with small, calculated betrayals, like a friend who starts lying by looking you in the eye. The graphs, always pulsing with micro-variations, now displayed lines too smooth, too perfect, as if nature had decided to follow a flawless mathematical pattern. To any ordinary operator, this was reassuring. To her, it was a glaring anomaly. The Arctic was alive, unpredictable, full of hidden noise, and when the noise disappeared, it was because something was drowning it out. She spent hours reviewing previous records, comparing readings and noting every gap with the care of someone constructing an invisible map. With each cross-referencing of data, the conclusion became clearer. It wasn't the radar that couldn't see, it was the radar that was being prevented from seeing. Hale watched from afar, without interfering, as if to see how far she would go before deciding whether to believe her. When she stepped closer to show him, he frowned. If you're right, it's not just a technical issue, it's sabotage. The word hung in the air, laden with dangerous implications, but he didn't repeat it. Instead, he suggested she rest, but rest for her meant letting the ice decide for itself, and that wasn't an option. That night, with the base plunged into silence, she returned to the control room and manually turned off the automatic reading filters. It was like removing a blindfold. Suddenly, the panel flashed with red spots and sudden variations that hadn't been seen before. The rift was growing at a frightening rate, and the epicenter throbbed like a fresh wound. Before she could print the data, the system rebooted itself, erasing everything. It became clear. There was more than ice and storm at work here. The radar was no longer an ally. It was part of the threat. The race against the living ice began without warning, only with the sudden realization that the weather had ceased to be a line and had become a funnel. Outside, the wind howled in broken gusts, carrying snow that swirled in circular patterns across the surface, eddies too small to be seen by satellite, but perfect for betraying movement beneath. Hale was in the yard, coordinating the transport of supplies, when she approached and spoke softly, almost as if she didn't want the air itself to hear. It's moving now. He didn't ask what, didn't ask how she knew. He just looked at the area where the white warped and understood. He ordered the immediate removal of equipment from the area near the slick, but Ross and some of the troops hesitated. Without radar confirmation, abandoning valuable material was practically a military offense. She wasted no time arguing. She tied a rope to her waist, grabbed the probe pole, and headed toward the spot alone. Each step was measured, and the sound under her boots revealed an irregular music, the kind of melody ice sings when it's about to give way. The crack didn't open with a bang, but with a deep sigh, as if the ground itself was drawing in a last gasp. As he dug the probe in, he felt the metal vibrate with a force from below. That ice wasn't just yielding under the weight, it was being displaced, pushed from within. A muffled rumble reverberated, and a dark line stretched beneath the snow, slithering like an invisible snake. Hale screamed for it to retreat, but at that instant the first rupture opened, revealing a breathing liquid void. The cold that rose from it wasn't the cold of the weather. It was the cold of something that hadn't seen light in a long time. She ran back, feeling the ice crack under her weight. Behind her, the line continued to stretch, as if it had chosen a path and nothing could stop it. The entire base in that moment began to realize that the race wasn't to save equipment. It was to save themselves, and there was no radar, protocol, or chain of command that could stop what was coming from below. The silent sacrifice began with a gesture so discreet that no one noticed immediately. As the troop rushed to the core module, carrying what they could amid the growing crackling of the ice, she noticed that some of the power and communication cables were still attached to the area near the crevasse. If those cables were severed by the shift, the base would be left blind and without heat, which would mean doom for everyone, even those already safe. There was no time to ask permission or discuss alternatives. She reattached the rope to her waist, adjusted the carabiner, and launched herself into the wind. returning to the point where the ground was already shaking under each step. The snow cut her face like ground glass, and the sound underfoot was no longer a simple crack. It was a deep wail, as if the Arctic were crying as it broke. She reached the cables, knelt, and began undoing the clamps with numb fingers, each movement demanding more strength than her body seemed to possess. The rope at her waist vibrated with sharp jerks, a sign that the crevasse was advancing. From the radio strapped to her shoulder, Hale's voice came through the hiss, "Come back now!" She ignored it. The last clamp released with a sharp snap, and she yanked the cable with all her might, pulling it away from the unstable edge. As she stood, the ice beneath her dipped slightly, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt toward nothing. She ran back, the sound of her boots mingling with the deep roar growing beneath. As she crossed the safe area, she fell to her knees, her lungs burning. No one applauded, no one thanked her, they were all busy saving what they could. But Hale, passing by, touched her shoulder lightly, and in that touch there was more than recognition. There was a silent confession that without that decision, perhaps none of them would be alive in a few hours. The revelation beneath the surface came when the wind suddenly ceased, as if someone had turned off the world. The silence that fell was not one of peace but of expectation, as if the Arctic itself were holding its breath. The entire base seemed suspended in time, and it was at that moment that a strange sound echoed, a wet, deep, almost organic sound that didn't suit the ice. She was near the observation area, still panting from the previous exertion, when she noticed that the water beneath the crevasse wasn't reflecting the light as it should. It wasn't the calm, opaque surface typical of polar waters. There was movement, slow and steady, like an inverted whirlpool. He knelt, shielding his eyes from the glare, and saw shapes moving beneath the broken ice. They were enormous shadows, without defined contours, but with a hypnotic pattern, as if they were swimming in calculated circles. For a moment he thought it was an illusion caused by the temperature difference, until he realized that the central whirlpool seemed to pull fragments of ice downward and return none. Each piece that sank disappeared, as if swallowed. The chill that ran up his spine didn't come from the wind, but from a certainty his body understood before his mind, that down there wasn't just a liquid void, and the movement wasn't random. She called to Hale, who approached without a word, leaning on the shaky ledge beside her. His eyes, accustomed to doubt, fixed on the water and lost their usual rigidity. "This isn't natural," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Around him the ice creaked, but not as if giving way. It sounded like something being dug from within. She took a step back, pure instinct, and the silence closed in on them again, thick, suffocating. Whatever was there didn't want to be seen, and yet it was rising. The decision which divided loyalties came like a sharp blade through the apparent calm of the base. As soon as Hale called everyone in the core module to an emergency meeting, it became clear that the situation was no longer just about ice and storms, it was about choosing sides. He exposed bluntly that there was an anomaly beneath the surface, something the instruments couldn't accurately record, but which posed a direct threat to the integrity of the structure and everyone's lives. Half the troops reacted with incredulity, clinging to the rigid discipline that demanded documented evidence before any drastic action. The other half, still stunned by the recent cracks and tremors, began demanding immediate evacuation. Ross, his posture stiffened, took the floor and indirectly accused those who had fueled the panic. A brief but charged glance in her direction. His words weren't just about safety, they were about pride. For many, abandoning the base would mean admitting weakness, and that for soldiers accustomed to holding their ground at all costs was almost a personal defeat. She felt the weight of that silent judgment, but remained still, letting the gazes fall on her and fall to the ground like wet snow. Hale kept his voice steady, but the tension in his facial muscles betrayed his inner conflict. He knew that if he ordered a withdrawal without technical support, he would face consequences upon their return, but if he waited, there might be no return. So he announced a partial decision. Part of the team would stay to keep the base operational, while the other part would prepare to move vital supplies and equipment out of the danger zone. It was a compromise that, in practice, divided not only tasks, but also alliances. The look she exchanged with Hale at that moment was brief, but it said it all. He had opened the door to action, even if his other half was ready to call it insubordination. And deep down, they both knew that from now on, any choice would come at a price, and the Arctic was already taking its toll. The rescue and the hidden price began the moment the supply team headed out toward the white horizon, while those who remained watched from base camp as the crevasse slowly and almost imperceptibly advanced. She was assigned to accompany the evacuation group, not by chance, but because Hale knew her perception could be the difference between returning or disappearing. The wind was treacherous, alternating between sharp gusts and moments of deceptive calm, and each step was a test of balance on ground that no longer held firm. Halfway through the journey, the ice groaned under the weight of the cargo sleds. One of the vehicles sank slightly at the edge of a newly opened crevasse, and the driver was trapped. Without thinking, she dropped her load and ran to him, using the rope to anchor them both. The rescue was quick, but cost precious time and energy. The extreme cold, already burning exposed skin, began to seep in, robbing them of muscle strength and mental clarity. As they resumed their journey, the distant sound of something breaking echoed across the open field. And it wasn't just ice giving way, it was deeper, denser, as if something had broken loose down there and was now moving. Back at base, almost breathless, she realized that some of the supplies had been left behind. There was no way to return without putting everyone at risk, and that silent loss would weigh heavily on her for days to come. But the heaviest price wasn't the supplies left behind. During the crossing, she had seen something from the side of the crevasse, a quick movement, a submerged shadow that followed the group from below, like a predator stalking its prey. She didn't speak of it at the time. She knew that if she did, it might trigger immediate panic and loss of control. She chose to carry the weight alone, at least until she was sure. And so, along with the successful rescue, she brought back a secret that burned more than the cold, and that could change everything at the wrong moment. The denouement began with a treacherous calm, as if the Arctic itself wanted to deceive them with a final sigh of silence. The base was on alert, half the troops on watch and the other half trying to rest, their uniforms still on. Hale paced back and forth, no longer hiding his tension, while she remained in the observation room, her eyes fixed on the distant line where the white of the ice met the heavy grey of the sky. That was when she realized something was wrong. The spot that had previously pulsed slowly now seemed still, rigid, as if it had suddenly frozen. This stillness was the most dangerous sign of all. It wasn't recovery. It was preparation. Suddenly a deep crack echoed through the ground, unlike any before, deeper and longer, followed by a vibration that made glasses, weapons, and bodies tremble. The lights flickered, and the radar, the one that had so often lied, showed a chaotic reading for a few seconds, lines rising and falling as if screaming. The crack opened suddenly, revealing not just water, but a black, reflectionless void. And then, for a split second, something enormous moved below, too fast to identify but large enough to make the ice tremble like paper. Hale gave the order for a full evacuation, and everyone began to move in calculated chaos. In the midst of this, she paused for a moment, staring into space, and felt the Arctic silence stare back at her. It wasn't a look of threat, but of recognition, as if the ice knew she'd understood it before anyone else. She turned and ran without looking back, hearing in the distance the sound of the crevasse slowly closing, like a satisfied mouth. Days later, back on dry land, Hale received an envelope with no return address. Inside was an old photograph of the same area, taken decades ago with a dark mark at the exact spot where the crevasse had formed. On the back, a handwritten phrase, "Some things only show themselves to those who know how to look." She closed her eyes, understanding that this was not just the end of a mission, but the beginning of a silent pact, the kind of karma you don't pay, you just carry. If this story has you hooked so far, just imagine what awaits you in the next chapter. Leave a like, subscribe now, and be ready for what's next. Ready.